September 11, 1944. A German observation post northeast of Ragen, right on the Belgian-German border. The sergeant's hand shook as he lowered his binoculars. American soldiers, clear in their uniforms, were walking across the border marker, not attacking, just walking onto German soil. He grabbed the field telephone, his voice trembling as he reported what every German soldier had been told was impossible. The enemy had reached the fatherland. Within hours, the news traveled up the chain of command, each level adding disbelief and urgency. By evening, it reached Field Marshal Jaron Ronet, Commander-in-Chief West, at his headquarters. The old Prussian officer, called out of retirement for the third time in this war, read the report with weary understanding of a man who had sensed this for months. The Americans were not coming in full force, just a reconnaissance patrol from the 5th Armored Division testing the Siegfried Line defenses. But the importance wasn't in their numbers. It was in the simple, undeniable fact that they were on German land. The Rhine was no longer a shield. The West Wall fortifications were no longer just lines on a map. They were the last barrier before the enemy reached German towns, German cities, German families. Brunstadt had commanded armies across Europe. He had led the breakthrough in France in 1940, twice dismissed by Hitler for suggesting strategic withdrawals. He was now back at 68 because the Führer needed his reputation to steady a collapsing front. He understood the meaning of this border crossing. The war had come home. He lifted the telephone to report to Berlin, to the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, where Hitler directed operations from his fortified compound. Increasingly, disconnected from the reality his field commanders faced daily. The conversation that followed would be repeated in many forms over the coming weeks. Reinstedt explaining the situation, Hitler refusing to believe it, the field marshal recommending tactical withdrawals to stronger positions. The Führer forbade any retreat. Every inch of German soil was to be defended. Every city, every town, every village, no step back. This was not new. Hitler had issued such orders since Stalingrad, North Africa, Italy. Hold at all costs. No retreat. Fight to the last man. But this time it was different. This was not distant land in Russia or occupied France. This was Germany itself. The abstraction had become real. In Berlin, Joseph Goebbels received the news with a propagandist's instinct for opportunity. The Minister of Propaganda had spent years shaping stories of German invincibility, then resilience, then determination. Now he had a new story, defending the sacred homeland against barbarian invasion. He called an emergency meeting of his staff. The tone of all propaganda would change immediately. Every newspaper, radio broadcast, newsreel would stress the same themes. The enemy was at the gates. German civilization itself was at stake, and every German, regardless of age or previous exemption, had a duty to defend the fatherland. Within 2 weeks, on September 25th, Hitler would officially announce the creation of the Volksturm, the People's Militia. Every male between 16 and 60, not already in military service, would be mobilized. Goebbels saw the American border crossing as the perfect justification. The propaganda wrote itself. The enemy had entered German soil, so total mobilization was necessary. But Goebbels, for all his rhetorical skill aside, Goebbels couldn't alter the military reality that Ronet and his commanders faced. The West Wall, the Siegfried Line that Hitler kept calling an impregnable barrier, was far from what propaganda claimed. Built in the late 1930s, it had been stripped of troops and equipment when Germany seemed to be winning the war. Guns had been removed and sent east. Fortifications had been neglected. Entire sections existed only on paper. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, which included the sector where the Americans had crossed, understood this better than anyone. At 53, Model had a reputation as a defensive specialist, a troubleshooter sent to stabilize collapsing fronts. He had done it in Russia many times. Now he was supposed to do it in the West. Model toured the West Wall defenses personally in mid-September. What he saw shocked him. Bunkers with rusted equipment, gun positions without guns, trenches filled with debris, minefields that existed only on old maps. The fortifications that propaganda called Germany's unbreakable shield were in many places little more than concrete shells. He reported this to Hitler. The response was predictable. The defenses would hold if the troops had enough will. Any commander suggesting a withdrawal would be removed. The West Wall would hold because it had to hold. Model, pragmatic as always, began working with what he actually had rather than what Hitler thought he had. The city of Aachen became the center of this clash between Nazi ideology and military reality. Aachen, Charlemagne's ancient capital, the city where German emperors had been crowned for 600 years. 31 Holy Roman emperors had been crowned in Aachen Cathedral. For Goebbels' propaganda and Hitler's sense of historical destiny, Aachen was not just another city. It symbolized German greatness stretching back a millennium. It also stood directly in the path of the American advance. Only 15 kilometers from the border the Americans had crossed in September. Hitler's order regarding Aachen was precise. The city would be defended to the last man. No civilian evacuation, no troop withdrawal. The garrison would fight among the ruins if needed. Aachen would be Germany's Stalingrad, proof that German soldiers could hold any position if they had the will. The local commander, Colonel Gerhard Wilk, received these orders with the grim understanding of a professional officer being told to carry out an impossible mission. He had about 5,000 troops, a mix of regular army, Waffens, and hastily mobilized Volkssturm. Against him, 2 full American divisions were preparing to attack with total air superiority and overwhelming artillery. Wilk requested permission to evacuate the city's remaining civilians. Around 20,000 people were still in Aachen, despite earlier evacuation orders most had ignored. Hitler refused. The civilians would remain. Their presence would strengthen the troops' resolve. And besides, evacuating a German city would send the wrong signal. It would imply Germany was losing. On October 2nd, the Americans issued an ultimatum: surrender Aachen or face its destruction. The ultimatum reached the German lines with typical American bluntness, 24 hours to answer. In his command post, Wilk read it and wrote his reply. He had no authority to surrender. Hitler's orders were absolute. He would fight. The reply he sent back was just as blunt. The Americans would have to take Aachen by force. The battle that followed lasted 19 days. American artillery smashed the city into rubble. Fighter bombers hit anything that moved. Infantry fought building to building, room to room, sometimes even floor to floor within the same structure. The ancient city, already damaged by earlier bombing raids, was systematically destroyed. Hitler followed the battle obsessively from the Wolf's Lair. Daily situation reports from Aachen arrived on his desk. He studied maps, moved pins representing units, and issued orders for counterattacks that existed only in his imagination. The commanders on the ground learned to acknowledge these orders, then do what was actually possible with the forces they had. Model visited the Aachen sector multiple times during the battle. He could see what Hitler, hundreds of kilometers away in East Prussia, could not or would not see. The defense was hopeless. Every day of resistance cost lives Germany could not afford to lose, and destroyed a city that would later need rebuilding. But Model also understood the political reality. Suggesting a withdrawal would end his career and change nothing. Hitler would simply replace him with someone willing to follow orders without question. So Model did what he could. He allowed tactical withdrawals when positions became untenable, then reported them as adjustments to stronger defensive lines. He pulled units out of encirclement before they could be destroyed, then reported they had successfully delayed the enemy. He played the game of managing both the battle and the Führer's expectations. On October 11th, 9 days into the battle, Goebbels visited the Western Front. He toured positions well behind the lines, met selected troops, and made a radio broadcast from a bunker that propaganda described as being in the midst of the fighting. In reality, it was 15 kilometers from Aachen, safely out of artillery range. His broadcast that evening was classic Goebbels. The defense of Aachen, he declared, showed the world that Germany would never surrender. Every ruined building was a monument to German determination. Every day of resistance was portrayed as a victory against overwhelming enemy forces. The soldiers defending Aachen were said to be writing a new chapter in German military history, worthy of comparison with the ancient Teutons who had stopped Roman legions in these same forests. The soldiers actually fighting in Aachen, listening to the broadcast on whatever radios still worked, had very different thoughts. They fought because they had no choice. Retreat meant court-martial and execution. Surrender could mean their families back home might face retaliation. They were trapped between the Americans in front and the SS and military police behind. One sergeant, in a letter that somehow reached his wife in Bavaria, wrote brutally honestly, "The radio says we are heroes. We are not heroes. We are men waiting to die because we cannot retreat and we cannot win. The Americans have everything. We have orders and threats." I do not know if you will ever receive this letter. If you do, know that I loved you and I am sorry. The letter was intercepted by military censors. The sergeant was arrested for defeatism and shot 2 days later. His wife received a notice that he had died heroically defending the fatherland. The propaganda version and the truth had completely diverged. By October 20th, Wilkes garrison had been squeezed into a few city blocks around the cathedral. No water, no electricity, ammunition nearly gone, medical supplies exhausted, wounded lying in cellars with no treatment. The Americans had offered surrender multiple times. Each time Wilkes refused, not because he believed resistance was militarily sensible, but because his orders left no alternative. On October 21st, with perhaps 300 men still able to fight out of the original 5,000, Wilkes finally surrendered, not because Hitler allowed it. In fact, Hitler had sent a message the day before promoting Wilkes to Major General and ordering him to continue the defense. Wilkes surrendered because there was simply nothing left with which to defend the city. The fall of Aachen sent shock waves through the German high command, not because it was surprising, but because of what it symbolized. This was the first major German city to fall to the Western Allies. Propaganda had promised it would never happen. Hitler had ordered it prevented. And yet it had happened anyway. Hitler's reaction was typical. Wilkes, who had fought far longer than any reasonable commander would, was condemned as a traitor. The garrison's resistance was called inadequate. The city's fall was blamed on individual failures, never on the impossible strategic reality. But Hitler's response went far beyond angry words. On October 22nd, the day after Aachen fell, he met with his military leaders at the Wolf's Lair. The meeting lasted 6 hours. No full record survives, but the decisions that came out were clear. First, no more German cities would be allowed to fall. Any commander who surrendered a city without Hitler's direct approval would be executed along with his family. This was no empty threat. Hitler had already executed generals for far less. Second, the Ardennes offensive, the large counterattack Hitler had been planning since September, would go forward regardless of shortages. Germany would strike through the Ardennes forest, split the American and British armies, retake Antwerp, and force the Western Allies to negotiate. The fact that Germany lacked the fuel, ammunition, and air support to do this did not matter. Hitler had decided it would happen, so it would happen. Third, every German citizen would be mobilized for total war. The Volkssturm would be expanded. Boys as young as 14 would be accepted. Old men in their 70s would be given rifles. German civilians would fight in the ruins of their cities if necessary. The generals at the meeting, men like Rundstedt, Model, and Heinz Guderian, the army chief of staff, knew these decisions ranged from unrealistic to outright madness. But they also knew that objecting would accomplish nothing except getting themselves removed. So they nodded, took notes, and left to carry out orders they knew would fail. Guderian, in his post-war memoirs, described the atmosphere at these late-war meetings with Hitler. The Führer lived in a fantasy world, he wrote. Maps showed divisions that no longer existed. Plans assumed resources we didn't have. Orders demanded victories that were impossible. Anyone who pointed out reality was accused of defeatism. So we stopped pointing out reality. This disconnect between Hitler's headquarters and the front widened throughout the fall of 1944. Americans advanced slowly through the West Wall fortifications. British and Canadian forces pushed toward the Rhine in the north. French forces approached Alsace in the south. Meanwhile, orders from Berlin became more and more disconnected from battlefield conditions. Model, commanding the forces actually facing the Americans, developed a method to manage this gap. He would receive an order from Hitler, typically something impossible, like hold all current positions or counterattack and restore the original line. He would acknowledge the order. Then he would issue his own instructions to his subordinates, orders that vaguely resembled Hitler's directives but were actually achievable with the limited troops and resources available. And when Hitler demanded explanations for why objectives hadn't been met, Model would blame weather, enemy strength, or lack of support from neighboring units, anything but the truth, which was that Hitler's orders were militarily impossible. This elaborate charade allowed the war to continue while everyone involved knew it was lost. The soldiers fighting on the West Wall understood this better than anyone. They could see American supply columns stretching to the horizon. They watched American artillery fire more shells in an hour than German factories produced in a week. They looked up at skies filled with American planes and remembered when the Luftwaffe had ruled these same skies. One lieutenant, writing in his diary in November 1944, captured the mood. Today the radio announced another great defensive success. We have successfully delayed the enemy advance. This is true. We delayed them by about 6 hours before retreating 15 kilometers. At this rate, the Americans will be in Berlin by Christmas. But we cannot say this aloud. We can only think it and keep fighting. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's grand counterattack, began on December 16th. For a few days, it seemed to validate Hitler's confidence. German forces broke through American lines, advanced quickly through the Ardennes forest, and caused panic in American rear areas. Goebbels' propaganda machine went into overdrive. The tide had turned. German military genius had prevailed. The Americans were being pushed back, but within a week, the offensive stalled. Within 2 weeks, it was clearly failing. Within a month, German forces were retreating. Having achieved nothing except heavy losses of men and equipment Germany could not replace. The last German reserves had been sacrificed in a gamble that never had a real chance of success. Rundstedt, who had privately opposed the offensive from the start, watched it fail with grim vindication. He had warned Hitler the plan was unrealistic. He had been ignored. Now German forces were weaker than before the offensive. and the Americans were preparing to push further into Germany itself. On January 12, 1945, the Soviets launched their winter offensive in the east. Within days, they broke through German lines and advanced rapidly toward the Oder River, the last major barrier before Berlin. Germany now faced its nightmare scenario: simultaneous offensives from east and west with insufficient forces to stop either. Hitler's response was to issue more orders forbidding retreat. Not one step back in the east, not one step back in the west. Every position was to be held to the last man. Any commander who withdrew without authorization would be shot, but the orders were becoming meaningless. Units surrendered or retreated regardless of instructions. Officers made their own decisions about when to fight and when to fall back. The command structure was breaking down as reality finally overwhelmed ideology. In early March, American forces reached the Rhine. On March 7th, they captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen before German engineers could destroy it. American troops poured across, establishing a bridgehead on the eastern bank. The last major natural barrier protecting Germany's industrial heartland had been breached. Hitler's reaction was volcanic. He demanded to know who had failed to destroy the bridge. 4 officers were arrested and shot. The commander of the bridge defense, who had actually been wounded while trying to blow it up, was tried in absentia and sentenced to death. That he was already dead from his injuries did not matter. Someone had to be blamed. But executing officers changed nothing strategically. By late March, American, British, and French forces had crossed the Rhine at multiple points. German forces in the west were collapsing. Entire armies were surrendering. Cities fell without the prolonged resistance Hitler demanded. The gap between Hitler's orders and battlefield reality had become total. He issued commands for counterattacks by divisions that no longer existed. He demanded cities be held by garrisons that had already surrendered. He forbade retreats from positions abandoned days earlier. The generals had stopped trying to explain. They acknowledged the orders, then ignored them. Some, like Model, continued fighting because they saw no alternative. Others began looking for ways to surrender to the Western allies rather than the Soviets. A few, very few, began questioning whether continuing the war served any purpose other than prolonging German suffering. Model, commanding what remained of Army Group B in the Ruhr pocket, surrounded by American forces, faced this question directly in April. His forces were cut off, with no hope of relief or escape. Hitler's orders were to fight to the last man. Model knew this would achieve nothing but the deaths of hundreds of thousands, who could instead survive as prisoners. On April 15th, he dissolved Army Group B, releasing his soldiers to make their own choices about surrender. Then he walked into a forest near Dahlberg and shot himself. He left a note explaining that a field marshal does not surrender, but neither could he continue ordering men to die for a lost cause. Model's suicide and his final decision to free his men rather than force them into annihilation represented the ultimate verdict on Hitler's strategy. Even the most loyal commanders had come to understand that the orders from Berlin were not only militarily impossible but morally indefensible. By late April, as Soviet forces fought through Berlin's streets and American troops advanced into Bavaria, the question of what German High Command had said when Americans reached German soil had been answered over 7 months of increasingly desperate and disconnected orders. They had said fight to the last man when there were no men left to fight. They had said hold every position when every position was untenable. They had said victory was possible when everyone knew it was not. They had said retreat was forbidden when retreat was the only rational option. The gap between what German High Command said and what commanders actually did had become a chasm. Orders were issued and ignored. Reports were falsified to match what Hitler wanted to hear rather than reality. The entire command structure had become a theater of mutual deception, with everyone knowing the truth but no one willing to say it aloud. In the end, what German High Command said when American troops reached German soil mattered far less than what they failed to say. They failed to admit the war was lost. They failed to acknowledge that continued resistance was pointless. They failed to recognize that every day of fighting cost German lives for no strategic purpose. They said what Hitler demanded right up until the moment Hitler shot himself in his Berlin bunker on April 30th, 1945. And then, finally, they said what they should have said months earlier. Germany surrendered. The silence that followed was more powerful than any orders, proclamations, or propaganda that had come before. It was the silence of a nation that had listened to its leaders' promised victory until the very end, and had paid an unimaginable price for believing them.